Thank you, Tony, and thank you all very much for coming. When a few of us decided about a month ago that it would be a good idea to organise a forum on climate change and various opportunities for Guernsey, I don't think we could ever have imagined that this many people would come, and I do apologise for those of you who are stuck out in the lobby. It does reflect what has been a huge and very heartening surge in concern over climate change over recent months, coupled with a real determination among the general population to begin making some positive steps and taking this problem seriously. So it really is wonderful to see so many people here. As Tony has said, I'm going to begin this evening's 4 presentations by offering a global perspective on climate change and introducing some of the problems that certain areas of the world may be facing over the coming decades. During my last 3 years of research, I've concentrated on some parts of the planet that are particularly vulnerable for various reasons to the early impacts of climate change. I've looked in particular at the Pacific region. I'm going to move over so that I'm not blocking the view for all of you over there. And I've looked also at the there we go. At the Himalayan plateau in the middle of the Eurasian continent. So let's move to the Pacific first. As most of you will know, the southwest and central west parts of the Pacific are literally dotted with hundreds of small islands grouped into a number of island nations. Now, one thing that almost all of these islands have in common is that they're very low-lying, sitting above low coral atolls and rising no more than a few meters above sea level. Now, obviously, this renders them particularly vulnerable to 2 phenomena associated with climate change, or global warming. The first, of course, is sea level rise. This results from 2 factors. The first is the melting of the Earth's cryosphere, or the ice regions. The second is the way the ocean expands as it warms, just like most things expand as they warm, but melting ice is by far the larger contributor. Those things combined are currently creating a net increase of approximately 5 millimeters per year in this part of the world. That might not sound like much, but if you imagine that accumulating over years, it can start to cause considerable problems for these communities, especially if, as is now being suggested, there may, before too long, be a greatly accelerated sea level rise if large parts of the Greenland and Antarctic ice cap begin to break up very quickly. The other aspect of global warming that's a real problem in this area is extreme weather, or more specifically, stronger and more frequent tropical cyclones. So these 2 phenomena, sea level rise and storm surges associated with strong cyclones, because all these areas are in the West Pacific cyclone belt, render these coastal communities very vulnerable indeed. Now, these are a few newspaper clippings from my local newspaper in Melbourne, Australia, where I've been living. We tend to hear a bit more about the Pacific in that part of the world, just because of the closer proximity. The one on the right here refers to Tuvalu. This is a tiny island nation, almost in the middle of the South Pacific. It was for a long time expected that this might be the first of these islands to actually be largely submerged and to have to be evacuated. In fact, just a few months ago, a small group of islands close to Papua New Guinea, the Carteret Islands, were evacuated as many of the coastal communities had become inundated with water. So the Carteret Islands islanders are now the world's first climate refugees, if you like. The outlook in Tuvalu and other nations in the central West Pacific, including Kiribati and Tokelau, the Mariana Islands, is certainly not very good over the coming decades, unless there's an enormous, immediate, concerted effort to bring our greenhouse emissions down and to slow the trend of global warming. Now, I want to pause at this point, before going on to my next example, to just get us to begin thinking about what these kind of trends mean for us here in Guernsey, and how climate change really does have to be factored into all our decisions and all our planning over the coming decades. Now, in many ways, climate change is a complicated subject, but it is also very, very simple in essence. The most basic fundamental relationship is that rises in atmospheric CO2 cause the greenhouse effect, which results in global warming. So therefore, the various activities that over the past 200 years since the Industrial Revolution have been fueling our high-consumptive, energy-intensive lifestyle in the industrial world. So we're talking about deforestation, electricity, power generation, inefficient transport and food miles, all these things which are fueling our high consumptive and energy intensive lifestyles, of course in Guernsey, as part of the modern industrial world. The increase in CO2 emissions and the greenhouse effect from this kind of activity is of course bringing about extreme weather, as we just talked about, loss of coastal communities through sea level rise, flooding as precipitation becomes more concentrated in some areas. It's reverse, drought, as some areas become more parched of water. And of course all of these trends result in a lot of habitat loss and therefore a lot of species extinctions. Now the important thing to note at this stage is there is really nothing controversial about this. I mean, you'll be very hard pressed to find a single peer-reviewed scientific paper of the last 20 years that really provides any significant evidence against this. This has really become an overwhelming consensus for over a decade within the scientific community. It took a long time for perhaps the argument to be won within the media and the popular audiences, but I think the argument over the reality of climate change was really won at some point over the last few years, and we are now very much into the era of having to find solutions. To put it very simply then, there really is a direct causal link between this kind of activity and these sorts of problems unfolding currently in some of the areas of the world more vulnerable, but also of course, and this is an important point to bear in mind, is Hurricane Katrina in the southeast US last year, and as a particularly severe drought in southeast Australia where I've been living have shown, it's not just areas like the Pacific and the Himalayas which we're going to look at that are going to feel the brunt of climate change. Even the most advanced technologically and wealthy nations on the planet are going to have to face up to some serious challenges over the coming decades if we don't start taking this problem very seriously. I'm having a little bit of a problem with my remote. I'm going to move over here. There we go. This picture is of York in England. The last time the River Ouse flooded a little while ago. And this next picture, believe it or not, is from East Anglia not so long ago. So although I'm looking at the moment at some striking examples from some of the less developed parts of the world, ultimately there are going to be consequences for all of us. So I'm going to move to my second example now, which is the Himalayan plateau. And I'll just begin with a map again, just to get some bearings and to explain the significance of this area. As you'll see from this map, all the major rivers that flow through India, China and the other populous countries of East Asia all have their headwaters or source up here on the Tibetan plateau in the mountainous regions of the Himalayas. The striking statistic is that almost half of the world's population, that's 47% of humanity, survive directly off these 10 rivers, including the Yangtze, the Brahmaputra, the Yellow, the Irrawaddy, the Ganges and so on. So, to put that another way, almost half of the world lives directly downstream of this one major watershed in the middle of the Eurasian landmass. Now, even though Tibet is often known as the land of snows, there's actually very little precipitation up here. Most of the snow you see in all those nice photos of mountain vistas is actually perennial snow. It's there all the time. These rivers are primarily fed not by heavy precipitation, but by glacial melt. Now, unsurprisingly, as the Earth's temperature warms and as the polar ice caps begin to melt, so too the glaciers start to melt, or retreat, as we call it. And that means that these rivers start becoming parched of their water. Now, the Yellow and the Yangtze, flowing through some of the most populous areas in China, are already very heavily parched. The Yellow River doesn't meet the sea at certain times of year. Now, the first accurate studies into the extent of glacial retreat appeared a few years ago. The most recent and sophisticated studies suggest that all the glaciers in the eastern Himalayas, and then spreading west progressively, will have disappeared by mid-century. And that would reduce the flow in most of these rivers by up to 50%. So unfortunately, again, we're looking at a pretty catastrophic scenario. If current CO2 emission trends are not abated very rapidly, and if the current trend of global warming is allowed to continue, then we will almost certainly be looking at some very severe, even catastrophic water shortages in some of these very populous areas. Water shortages, of course, lead to loss of arable land and eventually to famine and to starvation. So what we've looked at there are two particularly striking scenarios of what may be coming over the coming decades if we don't get on top of this problem fast. So what I want to do now is bring our attention back home to Guernsey again and start thinking about why this is all very significant to all of us in the modern industrial nations and the newly industrial countries, and ultimately to all of us on the planet. I like to look at it this way. In Guernsey, we're of course part of the global interconnected community, and we take advantage and reap benefits of this in a wide variety of ways, whether it's trade relations with other countries, whether it's importing food from different parts of the world, whether it's holidaying abroad, whether it's taking advantage of the world's storehouse of knowledge and expertise. We also, of course, take a certain portion of the world's resources and energy, and unfortunately in the case of Guernsey, it's rather disproportionate to our size. Now I think it's entirely fair to say that, bearing that in mind, we have very strong reciprocal obligations to the global community, particularly as we're going to see, because Guernsey is almost uniquely poised to contribute to the struggle against greenhouse emissions and even to actually lead the way in this part of the world as far as facing up to these challenges. Now it's about time I finish because we've got three more very important speakers, but I want to end on two positive notes. I think the first thing, which is very, very important to bear in mind at the moment, is that even though climate change is beyond doubt shaping up to be the biggest challenge of the next century for all of us, it's very important to realize at the moment that we can get on top of this problem if we're willing to act now and if we're willing to really act with earnest. We are getting more and more dire predictions almost every day of what sort of scenarios may occur if we don't tackle this problem, but we must realize at this point that we still have time to do that if we get on the case very quickly. The second thing to realize, and this is very much the theme of this evening and what our other speakers are going to be talking about, is that if we're really willing to get our teeth into this problem, to start thinking boldly and creatively, and to keep this problem of climate change and sustainable development right there in the forefront of our minds with all our decisions over the next few years, then we can actually look forward to some really exciting benefits for the Guernsey community. We've tended to think of climate change in terms of necessary sacrifices and compromised standing of living. It doesn't have to be seen that way. Certainly, we're looking at a time of crisis if we don't act on that. We're also looking at a quite unprecedented time of opportunity. If we take climate change as a sort of litmus test showing us that some of our activities over the last 200 years have been a bit awry and deeply problematic, and start thinking about how we can move to a sustainable, less energy-intensive lifestyle in the future, then we're going to see some enormous benefits there. Benefits that go beyond just reducing our CO2 emissions. This is something that Nick, Rosie and Andrew are all going to be exploring over the next 30 minutes or so. So, that's our general introduction. Thank you very much.